June 20th, 1942, Frenchman Bay, Western Australia. In cold grey water, a single torpedo slips from an American submarine and slices through a hanging net, far deeper than it was ever set to run. For Lieutenant Hal Mercer, the boat's torpedo officer, it's not just a bad test, it's proof of a betrayal that's been getting crews nearly killed and letting Japan's ships steam away untouched. Out in the Pacific, Hal will watch perfect shots pass harmlessly under hulls, hear hits that never explode, and survive depth charges sparked by premature blasts. But one defect at a time, the truth will be forced into daylight, and when the fix finally takes, Japan's shipping won't understand what's killing it, until it's too late. Frenchman Bay net test, 20th of June 1942. The sea off Albany looks too calm for a revelation. It's early afternoon, 20th of June 1942, and the water in Frenchman Bay holds the kind of winter-grey light that makes everything seem like steel. Steel sky, steel swells, steel nerves. The submarine lies low, barely moving, while a net hangs in the water like a curtain for an execution. Inside, the air tastes of oil and sweat and battery acid. Fans whine. Men speak softly because on a boat you learn to respect sound, even in peacetime water, even in a bay that isn't hunting you back. Lieutenant Junior Grade Hal Mercer stands where he always stands when a torpedo is about to leave the ship, close enough to feel responsible for it. He is the torpedo officer. If the fish behaves, it's because his hands and his checklists and his memory of every tiny procedure made it so. If the fish fails, it is still somehow his fault. That's how it's felt for months. On the bulkhead near him, a clipboard holds the test settings in neat pencil. Exercise head, no war shot. Depth set shallow, the kind of depth you'd choose for a fat merchantman on an even keel. The number is written like a prayer. 10 feet. On the other side of a hatch, men are topside in cold spray, tending the net and watching the range. 800 yards, give or take. Close enough that nobody can blame bad solution. Or target manoeuvring, the usual ghosts that get blamed when torpedoes do nothing. Hal hears the captain's voice, flat, restrained, cut through the compartment. Stand by to fire. A few men glance at Hal, not because they don't know how this works, but because they've all been living the same story. Perfect approach, perfect gyro angle, perfect spread, and then the target sails on, untouched. More than once, they've heard a hit, felt it in their bones, and then no explosion follows. Just a dead, insulting silence. Someone in the forward room calls back, "Tube ready." Hal checks his own mind the way some men check a watch. Gyro set, depth set. The mechanism is what it is. The Mark 14 is a handsome weapon on paper, fast enough, long-legged enough, with a warhead that ought to crack a ship's spine if it explodes under the keel. But paper doesn't dive. Paper doesn't run beneath a freighter and come up laughing at you. He imagines without wanting to the merchantman he's seen in periscope lenses, black hulls, white wakes, the faint haze of stack smoke. He imagines the torpedo track, a thin line of bubbles arrowing towards certainty. The captain again. Fire. There's the heavy, familiar thunk, compressed air, a shudder through the hull, the sense of something leaving you. A torpedo launch is never silent, not truly. It's a mechanical exhale, a beast kicked out into the world. Hal counts automatically. Seconds matter, distance matters. If the fish is true, it should pass through the hanging net at the depth they've set, shallow enough that everyone can see it, measure it and stop arguing. Men lean to listen for the faint, distant sound of the exercise head running. Some press their palms to steel as if touch will tell them what their eyes can't. Then topside, voices rise. Not celebration, something sharper. A shout comes down the hatch. "There, there, look at that!" Hal doesn't have to see it to understand the tone. He's heard that tone at sea too, the tone of men realizing they've been lied to by metal. A runner appears, face wet with spray and shock. "Sir," the sailor says, breathless, it cut the net way deeper." "How deep?" Hal asks, already knowing the answer will hurt. 25 feet, the sailor says. "Maybe more." For a second, Hal feels nothing. Then he feels everything at once. Heat behind the eyes, an ache in the jaw, a kind of vindication that tastes like rust. If it ran that deep here, on a calm test, close range, then in combat, under stress and swell and enemy zigzags, they've been firing under ships, under hulls, under history. The captain says nothing for a long beat. When he finally speaks, his voice is quiet, dangerous. "Record it," he says, "all of it." Hal turns back to his clipboard and writes, but the pencil feels too small for what he's writing down. 10 feet set, 25 feet observed. A simple subtraction that explains months of failure and months of men being told politely that they must have done something wrong. In the compartment, the crew begins to talk, low and fast. Anger has a way of filling a submarine like smoke. Someone mutters the old joke, torpedoes so bad they ought to be thrown by hand. Someone else says they should build a Bureau of Ordnance for every gallon of fuel they waste chasing targets they can't kill. Hal doesn't join in. He's thinking of the patrol reports, the attacks, the missed chances. He's thinking of the Japanese ships that delivered fuel and ammunition to islands that now have guns pointed at Americans because American torpedoes ran deep. He looks at the torpedo room hatch as if the torpedoes might hear him. "You weren't useless." He says inside his head, "You were wrong." Above them, winter wind rattles the bay. The net test is just one shot, one neat proof. But Hal understands something fundamental. The war is going to be fought not only against Japan, but against a defect hiding in a weapon the Navy swore was perfect. And in the Pacific, perfection is the difference between a sinking and a survivor steaming into the night. First patrol with bad fish, July 1942. The submarine leaves Fremantle like a man leaving a clinic with a diagnosis he didn't want, but finally believes. Hal stands on the bridge for a moment in the thin morning light, watching Australia shrink into haze. The Indian Ocean opens ahead like an argument. Somewhere beyond it are shipping lanes, shallow seas, and Japanese escorts that have learned to listen for the quietest predators. Below decks, the boat settles into patrol routine, the steady heartbeat of diesels on the surface, the constant checking of valves and gauges, the smell of coffee that never quite hides the smell of machinery. Hal's world is forward, with the torpedoes, long white cylinders lashed in racks, each one a promise that has betrayed them before. Word of the Frenchman Bay test travels like contraband. Men whisper numbers the way gamblers whisper odds. 10 feet set, 25 observed, 11 feet too deep on average. The math is simple. The consequences are enormous. They've been given interim guidance, field wisdom passed hand to hand, not printed doctrine. Set shallower. Cheat the dial. Lie to the torpedo so it tells the truth in the water. Hal does it with a kind of careful fury, adjusting depths with the precision of a surgeon and the distrust of a veteran. Days later, in enemy waters, the boat goes to periscope depth in a humid, waiting sea. The periscope rises, slow, controlled, until Hal sees daylight through a thin lens. The ocean surface is empty at first. Then a smudge. Then a ship, a merchantman. Not big, but loaded. Hal can tell by the way she sits in the water. A low freeboard, a heavy, purposeful wake. She is moving on a predictable course, escorted by nothing Hal can see yet, which means either she is alone or the escort is somewhere smart, circling wide. The captain's voice is a hush in the control room. "Torpedo data." Hal's hands move without drama. Bearings, angle on the bow, speed estimate, range. He feeds it into the TDC, the torpedo data computer, a mechanical mind that turns observation into geometry. Men watch the dials and repeat numbers like liturgy. "Set torpedoes bow tubes," the captain orders. Hal's throat tightens. Here it is again, the moment where everything is correct except the weapon. He gives depths, shallower than doctrine, because doctrine has been wrong. He checks the Mark 6 exploder settings. The influence feature is still in play. It's still the secret advantage. Detonate under the keel, break the back of the ship. In theory, it's a clean kill. In practice, it's a mystery with too many moving parts. The merchantman grows in the lens. The captain rides the periscope like a predator, lining the target across the crosshairs. Fire 1. The boat shudders. Hal counts. The weapon runs. Fire 2. Another shudder. Another count. The control room is silent except for the slight whine of motors and the ocean's pressure against the hull. Every man listens for what comes next, the distant low boom of success. Seconds pass, then more. No boom. "Did we miss?" someone whispers, as if whispering might make it less shameful. Hal stares at the depth settings in his mind. He'd cheated them. He'd set them shallow. It should have worked. Then a call from sonar, quiet, urgent. Screw noises increasing, target accelerating. In the periscope, the merchantman's wake sharpens. She is running. Either she saw the periscope feather or she felt something, an instinct, a shimmer, a rumour of danger. The captain keeps looking. No hit, he says, voice like a verdict. Damn. Hal feels the burn rise again. They had the range, the approach, the solution. If the Torpedoes still ran deep even after cheating, they're still hunting with blunt teeth. Hours later they get another chance, another ship, another setup, and now an escort appears, a small warship slicing water like a knife. The tension doubles. They can't afford to miss and then be hunted. Hal sets the next spread even shallower. He hates how it feels, like superstition in place of science. Fire. This time there's something. An explosion, yes, but too soon. Too far. A flat, muffled boom that doesn't match the geometry of a hit. Premature, Hal says before anyone else can. He hears it in the way the sound travels, not the deep, close concussion of war shot against steel, but a wasted detonation in open water. The captain's face in the dim light is stone. Again. They fire again. Another run. Another listen. Nothing. The escort turns toward the disturbance. It doesn't know exactly where the submarine is, but it knows where something exploded. That's enough. Rig for depth charge, the captain says calmly, as if ordering coffee. The boat angles down. The pressure increases. The lights hum. Men grip rails and watch gauges. Hal moves through the forward compartment like a man trying to fix a disease with a wrench. First depth charges bloom above them, distant thunder, then closer. The sound is not a bang so much as a crushing slap through the water, a fist on the hull. Dust shakes loose. A wrench clatters somewhere. Someone swears softly. Hal's mind keeps returning to the premature explosion, how it gave the escort a starting gun. How the Torpedo didn't kill the merchantman, but did advertise the submarine's presence. Between charges, there are moments of awful quiet. Hal imagines the Torpedo's little magnetic brain misreading the Earth, tripping too early as if frightened of the job. If the depth problem was the first betrayal, then this is the second. A weapon that either runs under the target or blows up before it gets there. Later, when they finally shake the escort, the captain lets the boat level out deep and quiet. Men breathe again. The ocean returns to being merely heavy. Hal sits at a small table with a notebook and writes what happened in a torpedo officer's language. Settings, ranges, results. The numbers are clean. The outcomes are not. He can feel the crew's mood, an ugly mix of fear and mockery. In the mess, someone will make the joke again. Maybe we should surface and throw the damn things. Hal doesn't laugh. He imagines Japan's tankers moving unhurt, carrying fuel that will become air raids and depth charges and more steel in the water. He closes his notebook and looks at the forward bulkhead, where the torpedoes wait like silent witnesses. In the Pacific, a submarine without reliable torpedoes isn't a hunter. It's bait that swims in the dark. Fremantle repairs and bureau pushback, Aug. Sep. 1942. Fremantle smells like diesel, salt and human exhaustion. When the submarine returns, her hull is stained with salt streaks and rust weeping from seams. The crew's eyes have that flat, faraway look that comes from too many hours of listening for death in the water. On the pier, the submarine tender squats like a factory that learned to float. Cranes, hoses, welders, men in dungarees moving with practiced speed. Hal steps ashore with his notebook under his arm as if it's evidence in a trial. Because that's what it is. In a cramped office with fans pushing hot air around, officers gather. Skippers, engineers, torpedo men. The conversation isn't polite. It isn't even fully Navy. It's the language of operators who have been burned and are done pretending it's their own fault. Hal lays out the facts, the net test, the missed shots, the premature, the patterns. Other boats add their own. Torpedoes that passed under ships close enough to count rivets. Torpedoes that hit with a dull metallic thud and did nothing. Torpedoes that exploded early like nervous firecrackers. Someone brings up the name that matters, Buord. The Bureau of Ordnance, far away, powerful and deeply invested in the belief that its weapon works. It's always the same, a skipper says. They say our approach was bad, our solution, our nerves. Hal hears himself speak louder than he means to. We fired a torpedo into a net in a bay, he says. Set 10 feet. It ran through at 25. That's not nerves. A senior officer, grey around the temples, eyes sharp, holds up a hand to quiet the room. He doesn't need to shout. Authority on submarines is a kind of gravity. We are not asking, the officer says. We are telling. Out on the pier, they begin making changes the way submariners always do. Directly, practically, with whatever tools are on hand. Until the torpedoes can be redesigned, they will be set shallower, a field correction, passed in orders and whispered cautions. Torpedo shops begin checking anything they can check. Depth mechanisms are inspected like the parts of a failing heart. Hal spends days in the torpedo room with the tender's crew, watching men open sections, measure clearances, check depth settings. There's no glamour, just grease and rulers and arguments over thousandths of an inch. A signal comes down from higher command. The Bureau has been notified. The Bureau is unconvinced. Hal hears it second-hand first, someone reading aloud from a message with disbelief, like reading a bad joke. The Bureau suggests the test is inconclusive. The net might have moved. The measurements might be wrong. Hal has to grip a table to keep from shouting. He can still see the torpedo's path in his mind, clean, unstoppable, wrong. Then comes a different kind of message, pressure from above, the kind that makes bureaucracies flinch. The tone changes. Not a confession, but a concession. The Mark 14 does run deep. The field is not imagining it. Men on the pier react like men who have been told the truth after months of gaslighting, relief mixed with fury. Relief because they were right. Fury because being right didn't bring back the missed targets, the wasted patrols, the boats that came home empty because their teeth were blunted. Hal watches the new guidance spread through the squadron. Set depths shallower. Be cautious of the exploder. Keep reporting every failure with hard details. The war becomes, in part, an experiment run at lethal cost. But the next patrol shows them something cruel. When you fix one problem, another steps out of the shadows. With depths corrected, more torpedoes finally pass close enough to targets to do what they were designed to do. And now, too often, they explode early. Premature detonations bloom under open water, far from hulls, startling ships into evasive turns and calling escorts like dogs to a whistle. Back in the torpedo room before sailing again, Hal stands over a Mark 14 as if it's a sleeping animal. He runs his hand along the casing, feeling the cold smoothness. "You'll run where I tell you," he murmurs, not for the crew to hear, "and you'll wait until you're close enough." He checks the Mark 6 settings again. The influence feature, the magnetic brain, still feels like a gamble. But orders are orders. The Navy wanted underkeel detonations. The Navy wanted secret advantage. Hal wants dead ships. They load the torpedoes, secure them. Close hatches. The boat takes on stores, food, spare parts, more coffee than seems reasonable. Men write quick letters they can't send until the boat returns. On departure morning, as the submarine slips away from Fremantle again, Hal watches the tender recede and thinks of the chain linking this patrol to a desk in Washington. A chain of decisions, pride and delayed admissions. Out at sea, the boat is again alone with physics, steel, and a weapon that has already lied twice. The ocean doesn't care who was right. The ocean only cares what works. Depth fixed, explosions go wrong, late 1942. The first time Hal hears a premature explosion after the depth correction, it feels like the ocean laughing. They are in warm water now, closer to the equator, where the sea turns a darker blue and squalls appear without warning. The submarine rides at periscope depth, creeping on electric motors. The boat speeds slow enough that even the men's breathing feels loud. A convoy slides into view, 2 freighters, maybe a small tanker, and a single escort moving like a nervous shepherd. Not a heavy screen. Not yet. Japan still has too many places to defend and too few ships to guard every route properly. Hal's calculations are smooth. The TDC takes the numbers, its dials rotating like calm eyes. The captain's voice is low, controlled. "We'll take the lead freighter. 1 fish, then a spread." Hal gives the torpedo settings, depth adjusted with the new hard lesson. Not what doctrine says, what experience demands. He feels almost hopeful, which on a submarine is a dangerous feeling. Fire 1. The torpedo leaves. Hal counts. Everyone counts, even if they pretend they aren't. Then boom. Too soon. It's unmistakable now that they've heard it enough. A premature detonation, the warhead exploding in empty water, close enough to feel through the hull, but not close enough to hurt the target. In the periscope, the freighter keeps moving. No smoke. No settling. Just a white wake that begins to curve as the helmsman reacts. Hal watches the captain's jaw tighten. In the control room, the atmosphere changes instantly. Hope collapsing into anger, anger into danger. The escort snaps toward the disturbance. If the convoy didn't see the periscope, they'll see the explosion. They'll know a submarine is near. Down, the captain says. Take her deep. The boat slides under. Men move in practiced silence, shutting vents, trimming tanks. Hal feels the familiar sinking in his stomach as depth increases. He listens to sonar reports. He hears screws above, then the faint pinging, active sonar, searching, probing. This is the bitter irony of the premature. It fails to kill the enemy, but it successfully starts the enemy's counterattack. The depth charges begin again, first distant, then closer, a pattern that suggests the escort is learning. The hull trembles. Light bulbs flicker. Tools rattle. Hal grips a pipe and thinks of the Mark VI influence feature, designed to sense a ship's magnetic field and explode beneath the keel. A brilliant idea, if the Earth were consistent and combat conditions were controlled. But the Pacific is not Newport. The Pacific has different magnetic fields, different latitudes, different everything. The influence pistol seems to misread the world and panic. Between attacks, Hal and the captain talk in clipped phrases over a chart table. The captain wants results. Hal wants permission. "Sir," Hal says, "there are boats, some skippers. They're disabling the influence feature." The captain's eyes flash. "Against orders." "Yes, sir." The captain looks away as if weighing two kinds of risk. The risk of disobeying the Navy's official guidance, and the risk of going to war with a weapon that won't behave. Hal thinks of merchantmen that should have been sinking by now, fuel that should have been burning on the sea instead of feeding Japanese airfields. He doesn't say it out loud, but it's in the room. A torpedo that explodes early is worse than a torpedo that fails quietly. At least a quiet dud doesn't call depth charges down on your head. The patrol grinds on. They get hits sometimes, real hits, explosions against steel, smoke and listing in the periscope. But too often the story repeats, premature detonations that spook targets into evasive turns, then a frantic dive under a storm of charges. One afternoon, after yet another premature, Hal sits in the torpedo room and stares at the mechanism with a kind of intimate hatred. He can picture the firing train, the trigger, the firing pin, the detonator, tiny motions intended to produce enormous destruction. A small failure at the start of the chain makes the whole weapon useless. The crew's jokes turn darker. They start calling the torpedoes Mark 14s with a particular tone, like saying an insult. Someone tapes a hand-lettered sign near the torpedo racks. "Useless fish," misspelled, because spelling isn't the point. Hal tears it down when he sees it, not because he's offended, but because it feels like surrender. If they accept uselessness as normal, then nothing will ever change. When the boat returns from patrol, their patrol report is thicker than usual, pages of careful documentation. Hal writes like a man trying to force the truth through paper. Times, bearings, distances, settings, results. The pattern is too consistent to ignore. Somewhere above the level of this boat, someone is finally going to have to say the unthinkable. Depth wasn't the only defect. And when that confession happens, it won't be a matter of pride. It will be a matter of whether Japan's shipping lives or dies. Pearl Harbor. The evidence piles up. Early 1943. Pearl Harbor is loud even when it's quiet. In early 1943, the base hums with rebuilding. Cranes swing, hammers ring, engines cough to life. The harbour still carries scars from 1941, but now the scars are wrapped in activity. Ships moving out, ships coming in, war becoming routine. Hal arrives with his sea bag and his binder of reports, stepping onto the pier with the feeling that he's walking into the centre of the argument. He's been transferred. New assignment, new boat pending, but the problem follows him like a shadow. Here the submarine force has more resources, more senior eyes, more pressure from the top. Patrol reports are stacked like cordwood. Officers in khaki move between offices with folders marked confidential. Somewhere in that paper is the record of wasted opportunities that can't be repeated. Hal sits in a briefing room with other torpedo officers and listens to men describe the same failures in different waters. Prematures near Japan, duds in the Solomons, hits that clang without detonation. A map on the wall is riddled with pins. The pins aren't victories, they're questions. A senior officer stands at the front of the room, finger-tapping the table like a metronome. He has the posture of a man who has decided he is done being polite about mechanical failure. The tone in the room is different from Fremantle, more formal but no less angry. "We have corrected depth in practice," the officer says. "We have inconsistent results. Now we are addressing the influence feature." Hal's ears sharpen. The influence feature, the magnetic part of the Mark VI exploder, is the Navy's pet idea. The underkeel miracle, the thing they've been ordered to trust. But now trust is running out. Hal is assigned to help gather evidence, compile reports, compare patterns, isolate circumstances. It feels like detective work. The clues are explosions that happen too early, too often in certain latitudes, sometimes at shallow depth. A torpedo that should detonate beneath a ship's centerline instead detonates beneath nothing at all. He reads the language in the reports, cautious phrasing, officers trying not to accuse their own ordnance system of failure. But between the lines, the meaning is clear. Boats are risking themselves for shots that should be easy, and the torpedoes are turning those risks into near suicides. Hal finally meets one of the officers leading the torpedo investigation effort, an experienced submariner with the eyes of a man who can smell nonsense. This officer doesn't talk like an engineer. He talks like someone who has had enough boats come home empty. "Field fixes saved lives," the officer tells Hal. "We're going to keep pushing until the weapon is reliable." Hal nods, and for the first time in months, he feels like the system might actually listen. Then comes the political reality. Not everyone agrees. Different commands in different regions hold different beliefs about the magnetic exploder. Some leaders cling to the influence feature like a lifeline, unwilling to let go of the promise that it can break ships' backs beneath the keel. Hal sees it in the messages, hears it in the tone of phone calls. The Navy is trying to fight a war across an ocean while also fighting itself over whether the torpedo is flawed. Meanwhile, boats keep sailing. Hal is assigned to a newly refitted submarine for his next patrol, sleek, cramped, smelling of fresh paint and old oil. The crew is young, hungry, and tired of hearing that submarines are one of the few offensive weapons in the early war, but not seeing results. In the torpedo room, Hal supervises loading. The Mark 14s lie in their racks like long steel bones. He checks the exploder settings again and again, as if repetition can compensate for mistrust. On the night before departure, Hal stands on the pier and watches a submarine slip away into darkness. Her running lights vanish, leaving only a thin wake in the harbour. He realises the torpedo scandal isn't an abstract issue. It isn't just paperwork and arguments. It is the difference between a boat returning with flags on her periscope shears and a boat not returning at all. And somewhere in the chain above them, a decision is coming, one that will either admit the truth about the magnetic exploder or keep submariners gambling with their lives every time they press the firing key. Order to kill the magnet, 24th of June 1943. The message arrives with the weight of an unclenched fist. It's 24th June 1943, and in the submarine's forward spaces, Hal can feel the mood shift before anyone even says the words. A radio man hands a decoded dispatch to the captain. The captain reads it once, then again, as if making sure it's real. Then he looks up. "We're disabling influence," the captain says. "All fish, contact only." For a moment, nobody speaks. It's not that they don't understand. It's that they've been waiting for this like men waiting for a storm to break. The influence feature, the magnetic secret, has been blamed, suspected, defended, argued over. Now, at last, it's being switched off by order. Hal feels relief, and then a sudden, cold realization. If the magnetic feature is off, then every torpedo kill now depends on the contact pistol, the part that detonates when the torpedo actually hits the ship. And they've already heard the stories. Torpedoes that hit and don't explode. The dull metallic clang that haunts patrol reports. "Understood," Hal says. He keeps his voice steady because that's his job. But inside he's thinking, if the contact pistol has a defect too, we're about to find out the hard way. In the torpedo room, the crew begins the work. Careful, methodical, done by men who know mistakes here don't just break machinery, they kill friends. Hal supervises as they access the exploder mechanism. Tools clink. Grease smears hands. Someone makes a quiet joke about finally getting rid of the ghost in the fish. Nobody laughs much. The influence feature is disabled as ordered. The torpedoes are now simpler. No magnetic decision-making, no underkeel magic. Just a straight run and a hard hit. Hal moves through the boat with checklists and the heavy responsibility of knowing that this change will either save their lives or reveal a deeper betrayal. The submarine departs Pearl, slips beyond the harbour mouth, and enters the broad Pacific. The sea is calm, almost indifferent, as if it has no opinion on human machinery. The horizon is a clean line that leads into danger. Hal spends the first days drilling with the crew, reviewing procedures, rehearsing actions, making sure the torpedo room can flood tubes and fire with smooth speed. They practice fire control solutions until numbers feel like instinct. Men joke less now. There's a sense that they are carrying an experiment into enemy waters. On the charts, their patrol area is drawn in pencil, routes between island chains, shipping lanes that feed Japan's war machine, fuel routes, ammunition routes, the arteries of an empire. Targets will be tankers, the captain says in a briefing, and freighters. We don't sink warships by chasing them, we sink warships by starving them. Hal likes that. It makes sense. Submarines are the quiet stranglers of logistics, but only if their torpedoes work. At periscope depth on a humid afternoon, Hal watches a distant mast through the lens. The captain tracks it, steady and patient. The ship grows, a merchantman with a high stern, smoke from her stack, the look of a vessel that expects to survive because so many have survived so far. Hal builds the solution. The TDC dials rotate, the numbers settle, it is a clean shot. Stand by. The captain murmurs. Hal feels the boat's life compress into that moment, every man waiting for the click that sends steel into water. Fire 1. The torpedo leaves. Hal counts. The crew counts. Silence is total, as if even the submarine's machinery is listening. This time the explosion comes at the right moment. Deeper, closer, a concussion that feels like a fist through the sea. In the periscope, the merchantman's side erupts with smoke and spray. She begins to slow. A wave of emotion runs through the boat. Not cheering, not yet, but something close. Vindication. Hit, sonar confirms. Hal's heart pounds. Contact pistol worked, at least this time. But as they maneuver for follow-up shots, Hal can't help thinking, one successful hit doesn't prove the contact mechanism is perfect. It only proves that in this instance, the chain of tiny motions inside the exploder did what it was supposed to do. They fire again. Another hit. The ship begins to list. For the first time in a long time, Hal feels like he's watching the submarine force's purpose become real. Not just harassment, not just scary stories. Actual results, steel ships dying because a submarine's weapon did what it promised. But then, days later, another shot produces the dreaded sound. A clear hit, felt, heard, followed by nothing. A clang. A dull, insulting impact that doesn't detonate. Hal's stomach drops. The magnetic feature is gone. Depth is mostly corrected. And still, the torpedo can hit and not explode. In the dim red light of the control room, Hal writes the details. He knows now what this patrol is becoming. Not just an offensive sweep. A proof. A final, brutal demonstration that there is still a defect somewhere inside the contact exploder. And until it is fixed, Japan's shipping will keep slipping through American fingers. Tinosa and the tanker that wouldn't die, 24 to 25th July 1943. The tanker appears like a floating continent. It's 24th July 1943, and the sea route between Palau and Truk is supposed to be rich with prizes, fuel moving toward Japan's forward bases, oil that keeps destroyers hunting and aircraft flying. Hal's submarine, now deep in patrol waters, has been waiting in silence, positioned where shipping must pass. At periscope depth, Hal watches the shape form in the lens. Tall masts, long hull, a heavy wake that suggests immense weight. A large tanker, the kind of ship that, if it sinks, takes a portion of Japan's war-making ability with it. The captain's voice is almost reverent. That's the one. Hal feels the pressure of perfection. A tanker this large is a dream target. The sea is calm enough. The range is good. The angle is good. The enemy's evasive action is minimal, because in the arrogance of survival, the tanker doesn't believe she is in danger yet. Hal builds the solution with hands that do not shake. Bearings, speed, angle on the bow, range. The TDC accepts the numbers, the dials turn, the firing data locks in. Hal sets the torpedoes, Mark 14, high speed, contact pistol only, the magnetic influence feature disabled by the June order. Depth set to strike near the vulnerable area, shallow enough to hit, deep enough to avoid the belt if there is one. Stand by forward tubes, the captain says. Hal leans closer, listening to the boat's quiet. He hears the hum of the gyro spinners, the faint noises of a war machine trying to be silent. Fire 1. The torpedo leaves. Hal counts. The crew counts. The seconds feel like physical weight. Fire 2. Another fish out. Fire 3. Another shudder. Fire 4. 4 torpedoes in the water, running toward the richest target Hal has seen in months. He waits for the explosions to come like a chorus. Instead, he hears nothing. Then a report from sonar that makes Hal's blood go cold. Possible impacts. The sonar man says, no detonations. Hal doesn't want to believe it. Impacts without detonations are the nightmare. But then the periscope confirms the impossible. The tanker continues. She might slow slightly, might wobble, might give the faintest suggestion of damage, but she does not explode, does not break, does not die. Hal's mouth goes dry. They hit, he whispers, more to himself than anyone. They hit. The captain pulls back from the periscope, eyes burning. Again, he says. They maneuver for another attack, careful not to expose themselves to escorts that might be nearby. The sea remains deceptively empty, but Hal knows escorts can be just beyond sight, circling like sharks. They chase the tanker through the day and into the next, stalking her like a wounded animal that refuses to fall. Hal watches the crew's tension accumulate. Every missed detonation is another chance for the enemy to notice, to call help, to turn hunter. On the 25th of July, they fire again. More torpedoes, each one supposed to be decisive. Hal checks every setting personally. He verifies the depth, the speed, the gyro angles. He does everything a torpedo officer can do, short of swimming alongside the fish and pleading with it. Again, hits without explosions. The dreaded dullness. Hal feels a kind of vertigo, like standing on a deck that suddenly isn't solid. If depth is corrected enough to get hits, and the magnetic feature is turned off, then the contact exploder itself is failing. The last component of reliability is rotten. In the control room, the captain speaks with the icy focus of a man who knows he is witnessing history's hinge. We bring this home, the captain says. We bring proof. Hal nods. Proof is everything. Without proof, Buord can claim operator error again. Without proof, the Navy can keep sending boats to sea with weapons that betray them. As they withdraw, the submarine slips down into the blue and runs silent. Hal sits at a small table and begins writing the patrol report details with a fury that becomes carefulness. He records each torpedo fired, each apparent hit, each failure to detonate. He notes conditions, sea state, target behavior, firing angle, range, anything that might be used later to dismiss the conclusions. But the pattern is too blunt to excuse. Perfect shot. Multiple hits, no detonations. In the forward compartment, Hal looks at the remaining torpedoes in their racks and feels a cold truth settle in his chest. This isn't a bad batch. This isn't one unlucky pistol. This is a design defect. And until that defect is fixed, Japan's tankers, the blood supply of the Empire, will keep surviving hits that should have torn them apart. Hal thinks of that tanker steaming away, wounded but alive, carrying fuel into the war. He thinks of all the times submariners were told they must have missed. He thinks now they can't say that. Now the truth is as heavy as a tanker. Kahulawe tests, August 1943. Pearl Harbor receives the returning submarine, like a courtroom receives a witness. Hal carries the patrol report as if it's a live explosive. He walks past sailors and trucks and stacks of crates, moving toward offices where men with rank and authority can either bury the truth or finally act on it. In a briefing room, Hal and the captain lay it out. The tanker, the hits, the duds. No influence feature. Depth set properly. Contact pistol relied upon and contact pistol failed. A senior torpedo officer listens without blinking. When Hal finishes, the man nods once like someone confirming what he feared. We test, the officer says. War shots, no more theory. That's how Hal ends up off Kahula, a dry, rugged island used as a target area, watching the Navy do something that peacetime caution had prevented, firing live torpedoes into something solid and seeing what happens. The test platform is a submarine. The setup is blunt. Torpedoes are aimed into a cliff face, a stand-in for the sudden deceleration of a ship's steel hull. Men watch with clipboards, cameras, measuring tools. This isn't combat, but the seriousness is identical. The goal is to expose truth. Hal stands among the observers, the air hot and salty, the sun hard overhead. He watches a torpedo run, a line of disturbed water leading toward rock. Impact should mean detonation. Instead, one of the warshots hits and does not explode. It's the same sickening betrayal Hal felt in the patrol area, only now it happens where nobody can blame stress, maneuver, or enemy countermeasures. Engineers open the recovered mechanism and study it like surgeons examining a failed heart. Hal leans in, seeing the contact exploder components, the firing pin, the track it rides in, the blocks and springs that must translate impact into ignition. Then someone notices it, subtle, deadly. The firing pin has deformed. The sudden deceleration has forced it to bind, to crush, to fail to deliver the necessary strike. In the moment where it should move cleanly to initiate detonation, it is instead stopped by physics. Hal feels anger and relief in the same breath. Anger that it was built this way. Relief that now it is visible, undeniable. More tests follow, including drop tests designed to replicate the shock of impact. Mechanisms fail in a startling percentage when striking straight on, exactly the kind of perfect 90-degree hit that training had encouraged. Hal watches a senior officer rub his forehead, exhausted by how small the problem is compared to how enormous its consequences are. A pin, someone mutters. It's a damned pin. But that's how weapons work. Great events hinge on tiny parts. The discussion turns immediately towards solutions. Hal listens as practical men begin proposing practical fixes, lighten components so inertia doesn't crush them, strengthen springs, change geometry, machine new parts locally if the bureaucracy won't move fast enough. And the tone is different now. It's not pleading, it's action. Hal is sent to the tender and the torpedo shops, where the fix begins to take shape in metal and sweat. Men machine modified parts. They test again. They adjust. They work late into the night because they know every day of delay is another tanker slipping through, another convoy delivering life to the enemy. The submarine force does what it has always done best. It adapts. Hal feels a surge of grim satisfaction as modified parts are prepared for issue. He watches mechanics install them with care. He supervises, checks, signs off. It's strange, after months of arguing with invisible defects, the solution is tangible, a changed piece of metal in his hands. But Hal also knows what comes next. A modification on the shop floor isn't victory. Victory is a torpedo that hits and explodes in enemy water. The tests continue until enough men with enough authority believe, finally, that they have the defect by the throat. And then the only place left to prove it is where submariners always prove everything. Out there, in the dark, against steel that shoots back. The field fix goes to sea, September 1943. In the torpedo room, the modified exploders look almost identical to the old ones. That's the maddening part. A sailor could glance at them and see nothing new. Yet Hal knows the difference is the difference between a clang and an explosion, between a target limping away and a target dying in the water. It's late September 1943, and the submarine is preparing to sail again. The atmosphere on board is sharper than before, not with confidence exactly, but with something like anticipation. Men have lived too long with unreliable weapons. Now, for the first time, they feel the chance that the ocean might finally do what the checklists promise. Hal supervises loading with a meticulousness that borders on ritual. Each torpedo is secured, each firing mechanism verified. He runs his fingers along the connection points and thinks of Kahulawe's cliff face, the torpedo that struck and failed. That image is burned into him. The captain visits the torpedo room and meets Hal's eyes. No speech, no theatrics, just a quiet understanding. This patrol will answer the question. They sail. They transit. Days pass in the submarine's strange blend of monotony and readiness. Men play cards, clean equipment, sleep in shifts. Every so often, the boat dives to evade aircraft or investigate a contact. The Pacific is vast, but it is not empty. When the first target appears, it is almost anticlimactic, a freighter, medium-sized, steaming alone. But Hal's pulse spikes anyway. In war, you don't ask for perfect, only for possible. At periscope depth, Hal builds the solution. The captain lines up the shot. The boat is quiet enough that Hal can hear the faint click of relays. Fire 1. The torpedo leaves. Hal counts. The seconds fall like beads. Impact. Then, detonation. Not a premature. Not a distant bloom in open water. A real explosion against the ship's hull, a deep concussion that seems to resonate through the submarine like proof. Sonar confirms. Hit. Explosion. In the periscope, the freighter shudders and begins to settle. Smoke rises, her wake falters. Hal exhales a breath he didn't know he was holding. It's not joy exactly, it's release. They fire again to finish, another hit. Another explosion. The ship's stern drops lower. She begins to list, the sea climbing her side as if reclaiming her. The crew's reaction is not a cheer. Submariners don't cheer often, not in a tube of steel surrounded by water. But Hal sees it in their faces, a hard, bright satisfaction, a sense that the war has turned a fraction. In the following weeks it happens again and again. Not every torpedo works. No weapon in war is perfect. But the pattern has changed. The clang becomes rare. The premature becomes a memory. Hits translate into explosions with the reliability that should have existed from the start. And something else changes too. The enemy's behavior. Ships begin traveling in tighter convoys. Escorts appear more often. The pings of sonar become more aggressive. The Japanese merchant crews, once complacent, now react faster, turning, zigzagging, throwing smoke, calling for help. It's the reaction of a system that is finally feeling pain. Hal sits at his table and writes patrol notes that are no longer a list of grievances. They are results, sinkings, damages, confirmed explosions, the language of success. One night, after a particularly clean attack, Hal stands in the control room and listens to the distant sounds of a ship dying, metal groaning, air escaping, the ocean swallowing. He doesn't linger on it. He doesn't need to. The point isn't drama. The point is logistics. Every freighter that sinks is fewer shells delivered to an island battery. Every tanker that burns is fewer hours of flight time for enemy aircraft. Every ship that doesn't make port is a tightening of the noose. Hal realizes with a chill that this is what submarine warfare was supposed to be all along. Not heroic duels, not dramatic battles. A quiet, methodical destruction of the enemy's ability to move, fuel, feed, and fight. And now, at last, the torpedoes are doing their part. Shipping starts dying, late 1943. By late 1943, the sea lanes feel different. Not calmer, never calmer, but more brittle, as if Japan's merchant marine has begun to understand that the ocean itself is hostile. Convoys run with tighter discipline. Escorts sweep wider arcs. Aircraft appear more frequently over choke points. The enemy is adapting. But adaptation can't make fuel appear. It can't build ships faster than they can be sunk. Hal's submarine operates in waters that once felt like hunting grounds and now feel like a trap closing around an empire. They lie in wait near routes where ships must pass, between islands, around reefs, through straits. The charts are scribbled with notes, expected traffic, last sightings, likely escort patterns. The captain talks less about individual targets and more about the flow. Tankers, he says. We need the tankers. Hal knows why. Warships can be repaired, guns can be replaced. But fuel is life. Without it, ships are pierside ornaments and aircraft are grounded metal. When a tanker finally appears one evening, Hal feels the old intensity return. The silhouette is unmistakable, long hull, high freeboard, a shape that speaks of liquid cargo. An escort prowls nearby. The submarine creeps into position, electric motors whispering. The periscope rises just enough. Hal builds the firing solution in silence. The TDC dials a line. The captain waits for the exact angle. Fire. 2 torpedoes leave. Hal counts. The explosions come where they should. Hard, close, unmistakable. In the periscope, the tanker's side erupts. Flame blossoms, not cinematic but functional. Fuel igniting, systems failing. The ship begins to slow, smoke pouring upward. The escort charges toward the disturbance, angry and fast. Depth charges begin their awful rhythm again. The submarine dives and takes the punishment. Steel hull trembling as concussions slap through the water. But there's a difference now. Even when the escort attacks effectively, the submarine knows the torpedoes did their job before the counterattack began. Hal listens to the fight above, pings, propellers, distant detonations, and thinks of the arithmetic Japan cannot escape. Every escort assigned to convoy duty is an escort not assigned elsewhere. Every extra zigzag burns fuel. Every rerouted ship arrives late, if it arrives at all. Submarine warfare becomes a campaign of cumulative damage. Hal watches it unfold in real time. Fewer contacts in certain areas because ships are hugging coasts, heavier escort presence because Japan can no longer afford easy losses, more radio intercept chatter that suggests anxiety. On board, the crew develops a rhythm of confidence tempered by caution. They drill harder because escorts are more dangerous. They maintain equipment obsessively because the margin for error narrows as the enemy becomes more alert. Hal keeps working the torpedoes, keeping them ready, keeping them honest. Every time he opens a mechanism for inspection, he thinks of the months when these same systems betrayed them. Now, the modified parts feel like a quiet ally. In the mess, the jokes change too. They no longer joke about throwing torpedoes by hand. They joke about how many ships they can fit into a patrol report. One night, surfaced in darkness to charge batteries, Hal stands on deck and looks at the stars. The Pacific sky is enormous, indifferent, beautiful. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese ports are receiving less fuel, less food, less everything. Somewhere an island garrison is feeling hunger and shortage. Somewhere a destroyer is tied up because there isn't enough oil to send her out. Hal doesn't moralize about it. He doesn't romanticize it. He simply recognizes the mechanical truth of war. Logistics is destiny, and torpedoes once fixed can change destiny. When the submarine finally turns back toward Pearl, she carries empty tubes and a heavier patrol report. Hal's notebook is full of attacks that ended the way attacks are supposed to end, with explosions that mean something. He thinks of Frenchman Bay, the net, the torpedo running deep through calm water. He thinks of the tanker that wouldn't die in July. He thinks of Kahulawe's cliff face, the bent firing pin that once saved enemy ships. Now, the defect is corrected enough that steel hits led to steel sinking. Japan's shipping, for the first time, is not merely threatened, it is being systematically strangled. Aftermath at Pearl, end 1943. Pearl Harbor welcomes them back with noise and sunlight and the smell of fuel, American fuel, abundant fuel, the kind of fuel Japan is beginning to lose. The submarine ties up, lines are thrown, hatches open, men step onto the pier, squinting like cave dwellers. There are no bands, no speeches, just the quiet efficiency of a base at war. Hal carries the patrol report ashore, thicker than the ones that once read like complaints. This one reads like a ledger of destruction. Names of ships, tonnage estimates, positions, times, confirmed hits with detonations that finally behaved. In an office, senior officers scan the pages. Their faces remain controlled, professionals, not celebrants, but Hal can see satisfaction behind the discipline. Reports like this are the language of strategic change. After the debriefs, Hal goes where he always goes, the torpedo shops. Inside, men in stained dungarees work amid the clatter of tools and the smell of metal. Modified parts are being produced in quantity now. Procedures have changed. Inspections are stricter. The lessons of 1942 and mid-1943 have been burned into the system. Hal watches a mechanic install an exploder component with practiced care. The mechanic doesn't know Hal personally. That's fine. The relationship here isn't personal. It's functional. This part, installed correctly, will become an explosion in enemy water. Outside the shop, Hal pauses and looks back across the harbour. Submarines sit at piers like quiet predators resting. More are arriving. More are leaving. The submarine force is growing in confidence and capability, and the enemy is beginning to feel the results in shortages and delays. A junior officer approaches Hal and asks a question that would have been unthinkable a year ago. "Sir," the younger man says, "is it true the torpedoes are reliable now?" Hal considers the word reliable. No weapon is perfectly reliable. The sea is too strange, combat too chaotic. But he knows what the man really means. Can we trust them enough to stake our lives on them? Hal nods. More than before, he says, and getting better. The younger officer exhales as if he's been holding his breath for months. Thank God. Hal doesn't say what he's thinking. Thank the men who refused to accept the blame. Thank the skippers who wrote angry patrol reports. Thank the investigators who fired war shots into rock. Thank the machinists who cut new parts on tenders in the middle of a war. He walks along the pier as evening settles. The sun turns the water gold. For a moment, it almost looks peaceful, until he notices the outgoing submarines preparing to depart again, their decks crowded with men and stores, their hulls ready to slip into darkness. Hal realizes the war has shifted in a way the public will never fully see. Not with one great battle, not with one dramatic victory, but with a weapon finally doing its job. In 1942, American submariners had sailed with torpedoes that ran too deep, exploded too soon, or didn't explode at all. They'd been mocked by their own bitter jokes, by empty patrol reports, by the enemy ships that kept steaming. In 1943, piece by piece, defect by defect, they forced the truth into the light. And now, as the next boats head out into the Pacific night, Hal watches their wakes and understands the future in simple terms. When those submarines find Japan's shipping, the ships won't just be attacked. They will be hit. And now, finally, they will explode.